Welcome to Off the Wall. I'm David Noble. You know, God is doing an amazing thing in the church these days. He is actually bringing His life, His reality back, not only into the church, but into our personal lives. And we're going to be going to the table right now with Pastor Mark Brisebois and author Ken Harrington. And we're going to be talking about the shift that's taking place, what that means to us, what we're going to have to actually let go of in order to grasp this new thing of God. We'll be right back.
That's the issue. Can you get it from the source? That's what Jesus trained His disciples to do.
The whole of the world is shifting. Culturally, economically, relationally. But there is one constant, and that's God. He never changes. We need to adapt and shift our thinking out of the natural realm that we've been raised in and move it up into the supernatural so that we can bring the answers that God has into this realm and we can really make a difference.
My husband Ken came to me with the book and I read what he had written, and it was really good with the doctrine, but I felt doctrine's often boring. And we needed real life stories to tell us about how we got from where we were to where we were going. We needed to see the shift of the natural to the supernatural. So I began compiling stories for each chapter. And at the end of each chapter, I felt we needed to give the people something that they could do. And we put in prayers, powerful prayers to move people into what God had for them.
First of all, we got to change our thoughts. The problem is our thoughts aren't God's thoughts. Our thoughts were developed when we were younger and were mostly protective mechanisms that we used. And we need to dismantle those things. We need to get those things healed. Once they're healed, then we can impose God's thoughts upon them. His thoughts then will change the way we feel about something, will change our emotions. Those emotions will drive us into proper action. Those actions done over and over will become habits. Those habits, over a period of time, will develop our character, and our character then will open the way for us to be able to move into our destiny. But it all begins with our thoughts. And so we have to go back and get those thoughts healed and make a shift into allowing God's thoughts to become our thoughts.
Welcome to Off the Wall. This is David Noble, and we're here with Pastor Mark Brisebois and author Ken Harrington. And we're following up on last week's show where we talked about this shift that God is bringing to His people in the church, where they're being moved out of a religious road and out of performance orientation, out of doing stuff, and coming into an actual relationship with Him. And so, Pastor Mark, we talked about just a couple of the first steps we touched on just before the end of last show, was that there's actually a difference between just coming at it naturally and, you know, from the scripture, reading the scriptures or doing things like that, and actually connecting with God and being a portal or a conduit for God to pour out His life into people's lives. So what else do we need to talk about in terms of
there's so many elements to this. Let me first say this, that the challenges we have today are no different than the challenges of the first century church, no different than the challenges that Jesus had dealing with His disciples. And you remember the things that He talked about. They didn't understand, they didn't believe, they were fearful, they were ambitious, and all of which, you know, is a natural part of the natural progression. Last week, Ken talked about the fact that when Peter walked on the water, previously they were in the boat and there was all kinds of strife and fear and unbelief and all that going on, but they didn't sink. But now when they stepped out on the water, just a tiny little bit of that will cause them to sink. So we're in a generation where God is moving us from one level to another level. But the reality is we're going from an unspiritual place to a place of being spiritual. Now, let me say two things about that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and 3, Paul is writing, and he's writing to rebuke the Corinthians for their immaturity, but he begins to talk about having the mind of Christ, and I think he concludes chapter 2, begins with chapter 3, about we have the mind of Christ. And I remember as a young believer, we would quote that, it's like, in Jesus' name, I have the mind of Christ. And but when Paul was saying that, he was saying that for himself and those who were part of his team, in contrast to the Corinthians. So he wasn't saying it as a universal reality for all believers. Right. And so it's not something you claim. And he wasn't telling them, okay, pray this way because you guys really need this. He was actually contrasting a spiritual man versus a natural man. Right. And that's the context that he was coming from.
And really that comes through the whole of the Testament, is this, really it's a different covenant relationship. That when Israel came out of Egypt, they had the law, and they had a covenant, but it says they couldn't keep that covenant. And Jeremiah goes, and actually it's quoted in Hebrews, the same thing. He says, but I'm going to make a new covenant. That he says, not like the one I made in the wilderness, because you didn't keep that covenant, but he says, I'm going to take my law, and I'm going to write it on your inner parts. He says, and then after that, it says, and no one shall teach his neighbor anymore, saying, know the Lord, for you all will know him. There's a different shift in having the Spirit in you and that law in you, so that it's not somebody trying to tell you how to do things and trying to match a pattern that's out there, but it's actually something that comes from within you that you release.
Right.
So how do we do that?
Well, we're going in that direction. But the first thing that we need to realize is that there's a very real demarcation between the spiritual and the unspiritual, and the Apostle Paul had a clear vision of that. And so we want to say as a beginning point that there's starting to be some real maturity manifesting in the earth in this generation. And there's so many things we could say about that. I almost don't want to get caught up in that. But the second thing that we saw, that Paul had a real focus when he talked about, he says, well, we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. And this is one of the characteristics of the spiritual, and really we see this played out in Jesus' life, where he was always living from, we talked about this extensively last week, he was always living from the realm of the Spirit. And he was always, everything he did was a manifestation of something from the invisible realm. Now, what people have done, and what church has done, and what mankind does, is we replicate. And so we see Jesus doing that. We see the impact of him talking, and so what we do is we go copy the speech. We copy the terminology. We copy the culture of the moment. We copy the style. And people do that with ministry. They do it with music. They do it, denomination to denomination. Whereas the training that Jesus is trying to get, and I guess we could look at Matthew 16, when he was talking to his disciples, is can you get the stuff from where I'm getting it from? That's the issue. Can you get it from the source? That's what Jesus trained his disciples to do, and unfortunately, we haven't been doing that.
And it's interesting, because I've been reading a book dealing with generational finances, and their basic premise was that by the time you get to the third generation, you lose the ability to make the money, because the third generation is connected to the money and not to the source that brought the money. And so God is starting to bring this picture out of staying connected to the source rather than to the stuff that the source produces, which is really what you've been saying, is everybody's making a copy. So they're looking at what somebody produced and says, well, I'll make a copy of that and I'll have the same thing, rather than actually have the ability to go back to the source themselves.
And herein is the problem. If you look at the macro picture of the church, is you have church growth, church development, church pioneering, or church planting, built on this idea that we look at a successful church.
Right.
And now we're going to replicate all of the parts. So, we've studied this, we've examined it from every angle. Every successful church consists of, it has this and has this. So we break it down into these components, and so we're going to start assembling these components together. And essentially what you get is a Dr. Frankenstein version of humankind. Dr. Frankenstein, instead of starting from a seed, he takes used parts and begins to assemble them. And that's what we've done in church planting, rather than starting from a seed.
Part of the problem is that it's easier to duplicate something that's already been done. It may not be successful, and it may not be connected to God, but it's easier to do that than to actually take the time to press into God and to, that's not something that's done easily.
But it's because you can see it. You see it and because you can see it, you say, well, I can do that. But the things that you can see are temporal, and they will pass away. They don't have any power. The things that you can't see are eternal. So we're trying to say the things that we see are actually the eternal things, when actually they're not. They're manifestation of the eternal things.
Exactly. Let's go to this passage in Matthew 16, because, again, I think I've talked about it on the show a number of times, but it's such a vital plumb line for what Jesus is training his disciples in. And you have all the other words and all the other things that he spoke to them about in regards to life. He said, I am the resurrection of life. He says the words in John 6, the words I speak to you are spirit and they are life. He was basically not saying memorize these words.
Right.
He was trying to get them to see the source of the words. So here he is. He's done this for some time. He's walked with the disciples, and then he asks them a question. Now, you got to realize, when Jesus is asking a question, he's not looking for information. Right. He's looking for something beneath the information. Not just like, I asked somebody, can you pray? Oh, yeah, I can pray. Here, Our Father who art... No. Can you get something that originates from the realm of the Spirit, that has heaven on it? That's the question. So here he is with his disciples. He says, who do men say that I am? Matthew 16. And of course, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, some others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he says to them, but who do you say that I am? Now Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now some people might want to focus and say, well, see, he got the answer right. He was the Son of God, and Jesus got the answer right. Let me tell you, the man who qualified everything he said, when he said something difficult, when he said something complicated, when he said something that was hard or something they didn't understand, he says, the words I speak are spirit and life. So what qualifies these as good words is not the content, but the essence of it. The words I speak are spirit and they are life. What he was looking for is, can you say something back to me that's not just doctrinally correct, but can you say something back to me that is life? And when Peter said this, he said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because why? Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. I know this. I know this substance. This is from above. You remember what we talked about? Yeah, right? The distinction Jesus was always making between him and the system that surrounded Israel at the time was, you are from beneath, I am from above. Peter, you've tapped into it. This is the model. This is the paradigm. This is where the kingdom starts. This is everything that I'm trying to do. Bring stuff from heaven down to earth. You got this from heaven. This is good.
That's fantastic. Now, I think we want to go a little bit deeper on this, and I think we're going to be going to a break right away. So let's talk about this afterwards in terms of how not only is it manifest individually, but what is the corporate expression of this? How does this look in the corporate church as well as the individual? This is Off the Wall. I'm David Noble. We'll be right back.
Designer Genes by author Ken Harrington is a book designed to develop the weak areas of your character. Authority and power is governed by our character, and the weakest part of that character will limit the power God entrusts to us.
Really, a take on what Jesus says is that you can't put a patch on an old garment, or you can't put new wine in an old wineskin. Is that God wants to empower us, but the container, which is our character, is not sufficient to function with more power. We're usually operating right to the limit of what we can handle. And if we want to go higher, then we actually have to die and go lower in an area.
To order your copy of Designer Jeans for $15 plus shipping and handling, please send your email request to info@watchman.ca.
Welcome back to Off the Wall. I'm David Noble. We're here with Pastor Mark Brisebois and author Ken Harrington, and we've been talking about the shift in the church. God's taking people out of that old religious road, bringing them into new relationship, bringing them out of the formulas. And now we're just trying to get a hold of that slippery fish, and just exactly how do we do that? How do we get to a place of connecting with God and being the spokesperson for God, as opposed to just doing
it's kind of like coming out. It's kind of like coming out of school. I mean, you can go to apprenticeship school and you learn all about, say, how to do electricity or carpentry or things like that. But until you actually get out there and engage in it, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And until we actually start to venture with God, we may think we know a lot of things, but we're not able to think like Him. Hebrews talks about us going on from all the doctrines, the washings and the doctrines of end times and all that stuff. And it says go on to perfection. And I used to think, well, what is that? I didn't really know there was anything other than the doctrines, because I hadn't actually engaged with the Spirit itself to see that no, doctrines are nothing in relationship. We're talking about a relationship and a person.
Yeah, there's to answer your question, there's two things. First of all, the question is whether we're unlearning or whether we're learning. All right, now we're always going to be unlearning to some degree, but if you've grown up in the church, okay, what we're talking about is going to be a lot harder for you than if you've actually come in as a first-generation Christian. You might have some other problems as a first-generation Christian, but unlearning the religious system will be harder for you. That's why what Ken said last week was so significant when he talked about how when the disciples were sent out the first time, he told them, okay, don't go with anything that you're accustomed to using. Don't go with any money, don't go with an extra coat, etc., etc., etc. So they had to throw themselves into a grace, into a kingdom function that they were ill prepared for. And that's kind of a picture of what God is trying to do with people who are used to a system. Let me try and illustrate this. In voice lessons, if you have somebody, and this is a common problem with people who are trying to sing, is some people have a disposition to sing correctly more than sing well. And the correctly is different than singing well.
Or even from their heart, right? They're not
hard. Let's talk about just the physical dynamics for starters. So a singing teacher or coach is saying to them, okay, you're not really projecting. There's not enough power behind your voice. So you're concentrating on having the right intonation, on singing in tune, but there's no power in what you're saying. So what we're going to do is we're going to set aside singing altogether. We're not going to sing. I just want you to shout. I want you to just make as loud of a sound as you can, but try to not do it from the throat. Do it from underneath, and you'll know that it's from the throat if your throat is starting to hurt. And so I want you to, and they'll actually try. They'll suspend the purposefully the activity they've been doing when they've been doing it from the wrong place, and say, let's put that aside. Now, can you just release something? It doesn't have to be right or wrong. It doesn't have to be the right words. You don't have to focus on the sequence of the words. You don't have to focus on the tune, whether it's in the right key or anything like that. Just project with power. Right. And that's kind of the unlearning that needs to happen. As people have been in a certain religious or traditional church environment, God is trying to say, okay, just come and be in a situation of life. First of all, just be there. And let yourself be inundated by that life.
But don't you need then, if you're going to actually do this, and it sounds like we're practicing it to some degree, we're practicing living or breathing properly. How are you going to do that don't you need an environment that is conducive to that is friendly to that? Because I mean, if everyone else around you is back the old way, doing it, with stilted rules and everything, how are you going to be free? to be able to do it? Is this part of the problem maybe that we've got?
Well, it definitely is
much
part of the problem.
negative
You don't have the
momentum?
right environment. You don't have a place where you're being encouraged to do this. Now, I mean, as you know, in our situation, our church, we worship a lot spontaneously. For some people, that spontaneous worship is very hard because it's like, where are the words? I need words to sing. Well, sing from your heart. Like, and I always teach on that because I said, listen, if you're dating a girl and you're planning to marry this girl, and you can only talk from some written notes, like that movie with Steve Martin a few years ago where he's training that guy how to talk to this girl, and all he could do is talk from the notes. So he had a little earpiece and he just repeat what was being said. You're not going to have much of a relationship. And unfortunately, what we've done is we've trained people in systems like that, artificial relationship, and whereas God is trying to say, look, I want a real people. I want a real relationship. And if you can't talk to me from your heart, if you can't relate to me, if you can't be where I am with the things that I like, we don't have a lot in common. We're not really going to have much of a relationship.
And I think this is what people are pining for. I mean, people are crying out for reality. They're crying out for the real. They're tired of the old religious activities and stuff like that. They want something
And they do.
real.
Even so, the transition, it's not just, wanting it is not enough.
Right.
Okay, because I've seen people, come into our church and, they want more life. In fact, recently I've had this situation come up again and again where people want more life. They come in, they say, wow, the presence of God here is so powerful, and there's this and there's this and there's this. Now, that's all good. But, if you just added to that, this over here, like we did at our church and this and this and this, and hold on a second. Maybe the reason we have that quality of atmosphere is because we don't have those things. And now that's what the traditional church person is looking for when they're coming. But maybe that's the very thing that's leading them to a place of lifelessness in the first place. Right. Sometimes you got to set those things aside because they put you in sort of the trolley tracks into a system, in a way of thinking and functioning.
It's like Israel coming out of Egypt. They were 11 days' journey from the Promised Land. But God said He didn't take them by the way of the short way,
right?
Because they were going to see some war there, and they were going to go back to the old way. So He actually took them out into a completely different environment, where they couldn't produce their own food, they couldn't get their own water, they couldn't protect themselves, they didn't know where they were going, and totally had to follow Him to try and change that mindset.
And by that same token, they had to depend entirely.
Completely.
Like anything they could do, they weren't allowed to do.
Right.
And that's kind of like people moving into the higher realm of the Spirit. What you could do before, you're not allowed to do all of a sudden. And the proverb says this. It says, do not lean on your own understanding. What that means is, if you want to go into something new with God, if you really want to depend on God, anything you've done well before, you're going to have to leave behind. It's not that it isn't good. It isn't that even God won't restore some of those things or bring you back to them. But really, to go to the next level, you have to be willing to leave those. But there's something in us that wants to anchor to what we know.
Right.
And we want to grab what God is about to do, but we don't want to let go of what we've got.
We don't want to take risks. It comes down to that.
That's what we talked about last week.
Yeah. Now, so there's two things really that are fighting against us here. One is ourselves. We don't want to take the risk. We don't want to do something new. But then there's a spiritual dynamic as well, because the enemy doesn't want us to get a hold of this. If we begin to breathe with oxygen, the life begins to come. All of a sudden, people are going to go, wow, I want to go. I want to experience that. I'm going to bring my friends.
Yeah.
And the churches will be burgeoning because God is there again.
Yeah, yeah. And, in years past, I would have made a lot more about, the part that the enemy is playing in this. Mm-hmm. But in reality, for those that are really willing and want to walk with God, there's nothing the enemy can really do to keep you from this. The only thing he has a hold on is your fear, your unbelief, your love of familiarity, etc., etc.
It's kind of the shift of the mindset where in the old religious system, Satan was my enemy. Well, guess what? I'm his enemy.
Yeah.
And that's the mindset we want to shift in, where that I am actually going to be able to change things. And this is what Jesus, this was his philosophy of the kingdom, that wherever he went, demons fled, sickness fled, provision came.
Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world.
So that he manifested the kingdom simply because it was in him. And that's where God's trying to get us with with that new covenant with Him in us, and we're not trying to get something, we're just trying to release something now.
Now let me share something, because there are people out there today who are pining for more and hungering for more, and you're not unlike some of the people in Jesus' day. And what Jesus called them to do, all right, was to starve their senses, to starve themselves of familiarity. I've seen this again and again, where people will come into a church like ours, where there's life, where there's something good, there's something powerful, and they come in, but they can't make the leap. They want to go back to what's familiar. It's like what we were talking about last week, where you like the water, you go underwater, but you can't breathe there, so you always have to go back to dry land and then come into the water. And so people start to compartmentalize their natural life from their spiritual life, because they can't really merge the two. The reality is there's a leap that has to be made. We have a testimony recently of somebody who was coming to the church. Actually, they were unsaved. They had been to some traditional churches. But anyway, at first they said they came to the church, and there was all kinds of activity, all kinds of stuff going on. And at first it was like, a little nerve-wracking. But they said, as they sat, it's like something began to penetrate them. And now all the things that were disconcerting to them, they think, I don't think I could go to a church that doesn't have those anymore, because there's an expression in them that is so life-giving. What previously was foreign is now, it feeds. And so anyway, if you're not willing to make that leap, you'll keep going back to what's familiar. So there is a cost to this. There's a cost to wanting more life. The power of resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings. If you don't embrace the fellowship of His sufferings, if something doesn't die, you can't live more.
Right. So God is calling you to let go of some of the things that you maybe are comfortable with, some of the rotes, the traditions that you've typically been in, and He wants to bring you into something else, something deeper, more of a relationship with Him. This is Off the Wall. We'll be right back.
One of the things we value here at Spruce Grove Community Church is family and relationships.
We're starting to see that it's not just about pursuing God in an isolated way, but pursuing God together as a team, as a family, through intimate relationship and transparency.
You see, if we're alone on this journey, it's going to be a lonely road, and we're going to get knocked over a time or two. But if we learn to come together as a family and push through these things together, we will go further and deeper into the things of the Lord. So if you want to be part of this family, we encourage you to come to Spruce Grove Community Church and check it out for yourself.
You are welcome to attend Spruce Grove Community Church. We are located 15 minutes west of Edmonton. Sunday services start at 10 a.m.
We've been hearing about this shift that's happening in the church, and it's happening in our own personal lives. And I remember, I'd gone to a number of churches as I was beginning to walk and develop in my walk with Christ. And I was always sort of looking for activities that I could do to make myself more of a Christian or walk deeper with God. And I came to the place of actually realizing that a bunch of activities doesn't draw me any closer to God, that it's about relationship. It's about getting close with Him, and that means really spending time with Him. Just like any other relationship, taking that time to listen and to be with God, not about a bunch of different activities. And so as I began to take more time with Him and be around people who were more passionate about hearing from God than they were about doing things. Somebody once said, we're not human doings, we're human beings. And God is calling us to just be who we are with Him. And so as I began to do and walk through that, I started to get closer with God. And it's been an amazing experience. God wants you to try and do the same thing. He wants to bring you into that place where He's pulling you out of the old religious rituals and into a deep and vibrant relationship with Him. We thank you for being with us here on Off the Wall, and we invite you to visit our website at www.watchman.ca. Lots of resources there. Give us some feedback on what you think about the show. And remember that the foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of man.